Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to another episode of the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Knight at Falcoholic. Kevin, we are here to bring you what will be the first 53-man roster projection for the Falcons, asking the big question about what is a very good crop of UDFAs. Now that rookie minicamp has officially kicked off today, recording this on Friday. So it's probably a little too early to actually make a firm guess at who's going to make the roster, but I do have my favorites. I do have my thoughts. Guys like Cobee, Bryant, and Nash in particular, I know are a hot topic among Falcons fans. Can these guys actually make Atlanta's roster? What about the rest of the rookies? What about veterans, that could be displaced potentially by this strong UDFA class? A lot of questions going in to this, the first projection. It's a different defensive coordinator, so that therefore it could be different scheme, different needs for this team in the secondary, along the defensive line, all that. And speaking of the defense, that's obviously where we're going to see the biggest changes. The offense is probably going to stay pretty similarly to what it looked like in 2024. Zach Robinson's still here. The biggest change, obviously, is that Michael Penix will be starting all 17 games, hopefully, this year, which should bring some much needed juice to this offense. But really the interesting thing is, how does this roster change? There's going to be a lot of moving pieces on the defensive side, a few things possibly changing on offense, but how does this team actually look on paper, looking at the 53-man roster? Because the Falcons have finally filled up everything to 90. So that's what the topic of today's show is going to be. We're going to take a look at sort of how you actually have to sort of trim this back now and see what sort of position groups are we actually going to be looking at. How are they going to construct this team on both sides of the ball from a very early look, right? We've seen one practice, so, and at that, only sort of reports on that practice, which was really just some 7-on-7 and some light work on the field. So a lot of projecting going on, but still a fun topic because we got a lot of new players to talk about, and I'm excited to get to that with you guys. So real quick, before we dive into that projection, going to get you a word from our sponsor, BetOnline, folks. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for all your sports betting action. Baseball season, to avoid the pun here, right, is in full swing, and we're into the NBA and NHL playoffs as well. BetOnline's got more ways than ever to stay in on the action with the latest odds, news, and scores, and even live in-game betting options while the games are being played. They've got the largest selection of odds on everything from MLB, NBA, NHL, UFC, all that good stuff, and BetOnline remains the best source for all your sports wagering information. And in between those games, you can head on over to BetOnline's casino. They've got all the top Vegas-style games, including poker, live slots, all that good stuff. If that's what you're into, you can find it over there on betonline.ag. When you sign up, make sure to use our promo code. It's BELIEVE, BLEAV, to get access to the latest promotions. BetOnline, the game starts here. All right. So, looking at this Falcons roster, obviously, if you haven't done one of these before, it's, I think, a very good insight into sort of how you actually build an NFL team, because it's 53 players, and it's typically, roughly 25 offense, 25 defense, although you can see some math stuff on either side, and we'll see that in this projection today. But a lot of people forget that there's 3 special teamers on there as well, right? Your kicker, your punter, and your long snapper. So that's what gets you to the 53. There's been a lot of pushing, especially with more games being added to the schedule, to increase the rosters to like 55 or 60. And I ultimately would support that. I think that would be a good thing for teams to be able to keep more of these developmental guys around, make it easier, because the practice squad did get expanded to 16, which is really nice. They opened up the practice squad during COVID, and they basically kept it at that number after, which I think is great for these guys that are trying to stick around in the NFL and sort of work their way up. I do think increasing the roster would be good, because right now teams are basically like really, really limited with what they can have. There's not a lot of room for injured players to stick on the roster. Right now it's basically like you have to put guys on IR if they're going to miss more than like a game, because there's just not any wiggle room. I think the NFL and teams would benefit from not having such a tight control on, the roster and so few spots, but that's something that they'll probably tackle in a future CBA, maybe as a part of these negotiations for this extra game, the 18th game that the NFL really is pushing for. It's probably going to happen sooner or later, alongside maybe another bye week, right? But at this point, still just the 53, so we'll see how that shakes out. But we're going to start things on the offensive side of the ball. Talk about that unit, which I don't think is going to change a ton, but there are some differences here. And if you want to see this all written down, you can go check out the article on thefalcoholic.com, which it'll have a write-up of this, and you can see all the names and all the numbers and that sort of thing. This series will definitely have a written component. A lot of these videos will also have a written component over on the site, so you can check that out if you want to see that. So offense, we're going to have 24 on the offense right now. So that'll mean 26 on the defense, a little bit more defense heavy. And I think that's mostly because the Falcons have a couple position groups where they really don't need to carry extra because they just have a really entrenched sort of top group that's going to take the majority of the snaps. They don't really need as many rotational guys. Starting at quarterback, the Falcons are going to keep 3 for now. Michael Penix Jr. being the starter, Kirk Cousins being the backup, and then I think they'll hold on to a third quarterback on the roster in Easton Stick. I know in the Matt Ryan era, we saw the Falcons usually hold just 2 on the roster, Ryan and a backup of some kind. But I think since then, we've basically seen the team lean more on having the third quarterback, especially now that you can have an emergency quarterback, activated on game day. I think they'll continue with that. And obviously, Michael Penix, riveting 3-game stretch, about as good as you could reasonably hope for. A lot of people that didn't watch the games will be like, oh, he threw 3 picks. 2 of the picks were fumbles by his receivers, right? Essentially. And there was something that came out today that Penix had, in one game against the Panthers, 7 big time throws, which is more than some quarterbacks have in like half a season. He was just throwing that thing out there, went up against the Commanders and went toe-to-toe with Jaden Daniels, who was essentially the rookie of the year, right? So I'm very excited for what Penix can bring to the offense, but he's kind of being relied upon as well to get this offense to that top 10 level that they'll probably need to be to make the postseason and get ahead of the Bucs. For now, Kirk Cousins is the backup and is the NFL's best backup, most expensive backup as well. Until a trade materializes, which I think is probably going to depend on an injury at this point, the Falcons are just going to hold him. And the reason for that is they've already paid him. I don't know why they would they can't cut him. They will not cut him, right? That there's no point to it. They're not gaining any money on that transaction. In fact, they would lose money at this point. And it doesn't make any sense to pay him to not play for you, right? So at this point, they'll hold him as an insurance policy just in case a quarterback injury occurs, in which case they'll be in a better position than pretty much anyone else, and hold him in case a team has their own injury that they're trying to find a solution for. I do believe they will probably not have too much trouble trading him eventually, but for now, probably just going to have to be patient on that one. And then quarterback Easton Stick is probably going to be the third guy. Was generally a somewhat solid backup for Justin Herbert over in Los Angeles. Not terribly inspiring, but in terms of a quarterback 3, he's fine. And he's probably, what you would want as at least like a somewhat experienced backup for Michael Penix. Long term, I think the Falcons will be looking for probably a veteran to be Michael Penix's long-term backup. But for now, and until Cousins is traded, they'll probably stick to like the cheaper options and wait to sign a more experienced backup until maybe camp cuts or something like that, right? Later in the preseason. So until then, it'll be these 3 guys. Moving on to running back here. 3 guys here as well. This one's going to be completely the same as 2024 for the most part. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier are going to take probably 95% of the carries, and Jace McClellan, I would have him as the favorite right now just because of the experience in the system. Hopefully he'll be a little bit healthier this year, and I'm hoping that he can show a little bit more as a result. The team clearly likes him. Same staff is in here that drafted him, right? So I think they'll shrink it down to 3 with Jace healthier, and the fact that they're not carrying Avery Williams anymore. He was allowed to walk in free agency. But basically, it's going to be a 2-headed backfield with Bijan and Tyler Algier, and they will take the majority of the carries, with Jace McClellan probably only factoring in like late game scenarios if the Falcons have a big lead, or if there is if Bijan or Algier have to miss time for some reason. So that one's pretty straightforward. Not too much to go over there. The Falcons did add some competition here. They still have Carlos Washington Jr., who has kind of been fighting hard for the roster and hasn't quite made it, but I think he's kind of on the fringe. So he could upset Jason McClellan. There's a possibility there. Also brought in Elijah Dotson, who I think is more of like a bruising back. I haven't really watched much film, but that's just kind of based on a quick look at his profile. And then brought in a UDFA in Nate Carter, who tested out crazy good at his pro day. I think his RAS, relative athletic score, is like above the 9s. So he's like a 90+ percentile athlete. I wonder if he will be more of a factor in like the return competition, but we'll have to see. Definitely someone who's potentially exciting, but I don't know if he'll be a real contender for the roster at this point. Maybe more of a practice squad competitor. So we'll see how that shakes out. Tight end, also, not much change here. I think they'll also keep just 3 tight ends, given that they're probably only going to use one on the field at a time. Maybe 2 if they have Kyle Pitts more as that sort of big slot presence, but we'll see. Kyle Pitts probably going to play the majority of the snaps as a receiver. Charlie Werner is going to play the majority of the snaps as a blocker, depending on what they're sort of looking for on the field at any given moment. In terms of tight end 3, I mean, it's kind of just pick whoever you want. I don't really have a strong opinion about any of these guys. I do really like Nikola Kalinic. His name is very cool, and he's someone that spent a lot of time with the Rams, and has basically been around this coaching staff a little bit in the past, is experienced in that sort of system in Los Angeles. So I think he could have a leg up as a guy that has some sort of receiving potential, but also good size and all that. So I'm penciling him in at this moment, but this could easily be a spot where the Falcons pick up a camp cut, or maybe one of these other guys they brought in, like UDFA Josh Simon, or Tegan Catoriano from the Texans, who was a former 5th-round pick. Maybe one of those guys impresses more. Notably, in this group, I would mention that the Falcons mostly brought in receivers. They didn't really add any blocking tight ends. So it may be that they're just wanting this person, other than Charlie Werner, to be like sort of a receiving option. They're not too concerned about this being a blocking position. Maybe they'll keep, sort of one blocker for those situations like Werner, but otherwise not really too concerned about that. So kind of interesting there. I figured they would want more blockers, given that, Werner played a lot and they kind of counted on him to be a blocker, but we'll see how that sort of shakes out. But that was interesting. Going to wide receiver now. I think they'll keep 6 receivers. It's a pretty standard number for most NFL teams. The top 4, I think, are pretty much 100% set. Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, Kadarius Hodge. I think those guys are pretty much locked in. London and Mooney, I mean, I think you could say this is the best receiver duo the Falcons have had since, this is the closest the Falcons have gotten to having 2,000 yards receivers since 2012, where they had Roddy and Julio both go over 1,000. Darnell Mooney finished with 992 yards. If he didn't miss the last game, he obviously would have crested 1,000. So I basically give it to him in my heart, right? They had close enough to 2,000 yard receivers. But that's one of the best receiver duos in the NFL. Falcons really struck gold on Darnell Mooney. That contract looks like it's going to be a bargain, assuming he can stay healthy, right? But Mooney is sort of their key sort of deep threat dynamic option. Drake London's more of their possession guy, but London can kind of do it all to some extent. He's not the speedster, but he's really shown that he can win at all areas of the field. Ray McLeod's kind of their yards after catch guy. He, I think, was better than anyone gave him credit for as wide receiver 3. I don't think he's a particularly big plus wide receiver 3, but I think he's a good one. And I think I would expect him to retain that role this year as the Falcons sort of transition to the future after this. But, I think McLeod is sort of a guy that they just liked and ended up winning that job, but maybe isn't the prototype that they want for the slot receiver position. And we'll get into that in just a second. In terms of the other receivers, I'm going to have 2 new faces make it here, which is probably going to be contentious. And obviously this is very early, and to mention Kadarius Hodge real quick, I think he's locked in as their special teams ace and primary depth guy. That's kind of what he was last year. He could play outside, he could play inside, just a good depth receiver. won them that all-important game as well. Unfortunately, it didn't end up mattering, but he was critical in that overtime victory, so good for him. I think he deserves a chance as a depth receiver too. The Falcons were clearly looking to improve the return position, letting Avery Williams go. He just never seemed to get back to his prior form after his injury. So the Falcons bring in Jamal Agnew, and if he can be healthy, I think he'll be a meaningful upgrade. He's still one of the best return specialists in the NFL. So if he stays healthy, I think he'll have a good shot to make it as the return specialist. I don't think he's really going to factor in on offense unless there's a bunch of injuries. The battle for the final receiver, I think, will be very, very contentious, right? I think there's a lot of guys that are going to be fighting for that. Obviously, second-year guy Casey Washington is going to be a favorite of many. I think, the Falcons brought in a ton of big receivers to challenge for that role, which I think should tell you that they're not, banking on Casey Washington winning that battle. But you look up and down this list, they brought in just a ton of big receivers. Chris Blair's back, who I think also has a good shot at this spot. Dylan Drummond's 6'3", I think. Mekhi Polka's 6'3", Jesse Matthews 6'1", David Sills 6'2", 6'3", Quincy Skinner's 6'2", one of the UDFAs, and the other UDFA, Nick Nash, also 6'3", big-bodied receiver. I think the Falcons are looking for a bigger slot option, someone that may be able to play slot and outside to give them a more interchangeable trio, or at least duo with Drake London, who also moves into the slot on occasion. And I'm going to go with Nick Nash here as sort of a sleeper option to even beat out Casey Washington for this role. I think there's really something to Nick Nash. You don't go from playing quarterback 2 years ago, which is what he was doing, to becoming a wide receiver, and not just becoming a wide receiver, but winning the Triple Crown in Division I college football, which means leading the NCAA in receiving yardage. He had almost 1,400 yards. Receptions, he had over 100 receptions, 104, and receiving touchdowns, which he had 16. And I don't think you just luck into that, right? I don't think you just wave your hands and you just become this incredible productive receiver just because of target volume or all this stuff. His yards per target, were still very good. I think his yards per reception were still quite good. So I think there's something here. And Nick Nash has the size. He's got great hands. I think he's really worked hard on the nuances of the position, which is really impressive for someone who spent so little time at the position. He's just not a plus athlete. I think he's a fairly average athlete. But I think that's fine for him. I think he wins with his size, his savvy, and his physicality at the catch point. He's got tremendous body control and contact balance. Not someone that's going to run away from anyone at the NFL level, but he creates separation with sort of little things that you would expect like a 7-year vet of the wide receiver position to do that he's kind of already learned how to do. So that gives me a lot of hope for him being a quick learner and someone that can just impress right away and make a roster. I wasn't expecting to like him as much as I did, but it was very impressive. There's been a lot of comparisons, obviously, to Mohamed Sanu because he is a former quarterback. And yes, for those asking, he did throw 2 passing touchdowns in 2024 on trick plays. So that is something he's capable of doing. If the Falcons want to throw in some of those weird plays from time to time, he can throw the football. I do like Nick Nash. I think he's a fun option. Obviously, I think he could play special teams given his size, which is kind of critical for these bottom of the roster positions. So he's someone that I would really like to see show out in training camp as someone who could potentially become a wide receiver 3 for you over time. I think he's got something special. So I'm excited to see how he adjusts to the NFL in training camp this year. Moving on to the offensive line, not too many changes here. The big one being Drew Dahlman leaves in free agency. Ryan Newsel comes in to replace him. Newsel still hasn't signed his RFA tender. That's not a huge deal. I mean, it's kind of odd that he hasn't done it yet. But there's not really, I don't really get the point of him not signing it at this point. I don't know if they're working out some sort of extension or a longer term deal. But at this point, Newsel's going to be your starter at center. But the rest of the line will be unchanged. Jake Matthews at left tackle, Matthew Bergeron at left guard, Chris Lindstrom at right guard, and then Caleb McGarry at right tackle. In terms of the depth guys, I do think they'll keep like the 9 offensive linemen, so they'll have 4 depth guys on the roster because they want to sort of stash some of these guys and not risk them on the squad. Storm Norton's going to be your swing tackle. He's one of the better swing tackles in the NFL. Very reliable. Had to play several games last year. Looked pretty good. So happy to have him back. I think he's someone you just keep around as long as you can. I think rookie 7th rounder Jack Nelson obviously has the advantage for another tackle spot on the roster as a guy that I think they'd love to develop without having to risk him on the squad. So I think he's got a leg up on the roster as a result of that. And then 2 interior guys for the backups. There's going to be a battle between, I think, Elijah Wilkinson and Kyle Hinton for the backup guard spot. And again, Hinton and Wilkinson can also play tackle, which helps their case. I think Wilkinson's better, so I lean towards Wilkinson, but the team has tended to prefer Kyle Hinton, so it's sort of pick your poison there. But I do think Elijah Wilkinson's a better player. So I wouldn't be surprised if he wins it in the end. And then at backup center, I think right now I'd have to give the edge to Javon Gwynn. The team's been sort of preparing him and developing him at center over the past couple years. It's kind of now or never for him. The team did bring in Joshua Gray as a UDFA, who is someone who also is probably going to switch to center and be the 3rd center during camp in the preseason and all that. So I'm interested to see how Gray performs. I think he's got a chance at the practice squad. But, he could also supplant Gwynn, who, honestly, what we've seen from him in the preseason has not been overly encouraging, but another year could help him out there. So we'll see. The edge goes to Gwynn sort of at the moment. Let's move over to the defensive side of the ball where the Falcons will carry 26 players. So 26 players on defense for the Falcons. We're going to start with the edge group, which is probably the most interesting group to talk about, right? The defense as a whole is just a little bit more interesting. I have 6 edge guys, quote unquote. I do think there'll be some mixing and matching going on here, but, I think I think there's going to be sort of 2 roles that they have for their edge players, right? One of them will be sort of like the stand-up Leo style edge rushers. And then they'll also have sort of 5-tech big end style guys as well. So for the stand-up Leo guys, I have Arnold Ebiketie, Leonard Floyd, and then the rookies, Jalen Walker and James Pierce Jr. in there. And again, there may be some mixing and matching from time to time, and I think there will be a lot of flexibility, and there'll be like a mixing of the usage, right? Like, so on 3rd and long, for example, there might be 2 stand-up rushers or like 2 pass rush specialists or whatever. And then on like goal line or short yardage, they may have 2 5-techs out there. They may have 2 of the big ends, right? Speaking of those big ends, I think it'll be Zach Harrison and Braylon Trice, as well as Brandon Dorless mixing in, even though I have Dorless listed under the interior guys. He's going to play both, according to Nate Ollie. So, he's going to be in that mix as well. But basically, I think on a majority of plays, we'll see 1 like stand-up Leo guy and 1 5-tech big end on the field at the same time. So the Falcons have that more balance to their front. But yeah, I think Arnold Ebiketie, it's a critical contract year for him. Should have a pretty substantial role, even with the rookies in the mix. I like his potential now not having to be sort of weirdly be the guy. Even after the Falcons traded for Matt Judon, it was Ebiketie who kind of had to be the team's best pass rusher yet again. I just don't think that's ever really been his thing. I think he's just a good number 2 pass rusher, and maybe even best off as like a number 3. But I think he's a good player. I'm happy to have him here. I think he'll be able to help these young guys sort of get acclimated. After that, Leonard Floyd, I think, is a specialized player for Atlanta. They paid him a lot of money to be a designated pass rusher, I think. But look, he's coming off an 8.5 sack year. Yes, he's going to be going into his age 33 season. Probably isn't going to play a huge snap count, but I think he's going to be their pass rush, sort of ringer, right? I think he's going to be one of their pass rush specialists. And you do need a lot of guys to rotate. You need a good rotation, guys that are fresh to get to the quarterback, especially, if you're going up against these passing games that throw a ton of passes. He's going to play a major role for them. And then, of course, there's the 2 rookies in Jalen Walker and James Pierce Jr. I think they're both going to integrate into this group. I don't know how quickly they will, quote-unquote, start. But I think, we'll see quickly like that these guys get snaps. Jalen Walker, I think, is going to play a little bit of a more versatile sort of role. I think he's going to have some Sam linebacker, like overhang snaps in like a base package. Like, I don't think he's going to be a base end for the Falcons. But I think they'll probably try to keep him on the field as much as they can, sort of like as that third linebacker in base defense. Whereas James Pierce Jr., I think, is going to be more of a traditional edge rusher that just plays edge. But I think both are going to play quite a bit. And hopefully we'll see them both come on pretty strong early in the season. The big ends are going to be more your run defense focused guys that are going to have to go head up against the offensive tackle, take on blocks, set the edge. It's great to see Zach Harrison moving back to the edge. That's what he is. He's an edge rusher. Apparently they're going to have him continue to hold, the extra weight. I guess that's fine. But he's big, he's powerful, super long. I think he's going to be much better outside. Braylon Trice, I know a lot of people think he's more of a stand-up guy. He did stand up in college, but don't forget he's 275, or at least that's what he was last year. I think he's going to be one of those bigger and base defense type of guys, who also is, someone who had a lot of pass rush juice in college, one of the best pressure players in college football back in 2023. So we'll see, hopefully, him come back healthy this year and be able to contribute. And then Brandon Dorlus is the same thing. He's going to be even bigger probably than Harrison in terms of weight. And he's going to play a fair amount of interior as well as probably like a pass rusher. But I think he'll factor in as like a 5 tech as well as needed. Moving on to the interior defensive line, again, have 6 guys here too. They're going to carry 12 total defensive linemen. I think they want to stack this group and have a very strong rotation. I think that's going to produce better results for them. So I'm fully in support of that. The big question here is like David Onyemata. Is he going to stick around? This was probably the most disappointing unit on the defense last year. Everyone underperformed relative to 2023, and that was probably Jimmy Lake to some extent, but also these guys were just getting older. Jarrett was released, so that hurts my soul, but it was like $20 million in cap savings. It was ridiculous, so I get why they did it, and I think that's probably going to be Onyemata's outlook as well. Onyemata right now has the 3rd highest cap hit on the team. The post-June 1st release would save $10 million for Atlanta. That's a lot of savings, and because Onyemata's contract was restructured, he can't be designated a post-June 1st cut. The cut has to happen after June 1st. So for those saying like, oh, well, if they were going to do it, they would have done it already. They can't have done it already. So I would keep a close eye on that one. I also think there's a fair chance that they'll just, they've already made their free agency moves for the most part, so that they may just sort of wait and see how he looks in camp, let him compete, and that's fine too. I would expect if they let him compete, he'll probably win a roster spot, or at least I hope that he will. But I'm not sure there. But other than Onyemata, who I think is kind of a question mark as if he'll be on the roster or not, Ruka Rororo, the expectation should be for him to start with high expectations. Didn't play much in 2024, but kind of has to now. Same thing with Brandon Dorlus, although I think he's going to be more of that inside-outside player. Think of like, if you remember the Quinn years, Derek Shelby, who was more of that big end in base defense and then kicked inside as a pass rusher. I think he might end up playing like the most sort of multiple role of anyone. So I'm excited to see what they do with Dorlus. I do like him a lot. In that same vein is kind of like Morgan Fox, who is more just like a pass rush specialist. But I think you need a deep group of pass rushers against some of these teams. And I think Morgan Fox is a great example of that. He's going to be able to contribute there. One of the more interesting names, like Hale London, was more of like a rotational guy who could do a couple different things. Falcons had him playing 3 tech some, had him playing some 1 tech, had him playing, whatever. He's back and apparently has bulked up to 330, which is significant. It seems like he's kind of penciled in as their nose tackle. They didn't really bring in any other nose tackles or anyone else. So it seems like he's got a path to the roster if he can show that he could be an NFL caliber nose tackle. So that's a great pathway for him. I think he's been a contributor that could be depended on before. So it seems like they like him. And the fact that he was able to get to that weight quickly is great for his chances of making this roster. And then I think in terms of like just another guy that you'd like to have around, Taquan Graham, I think he kind of rounds out the unit. He could do a little bit of everything. I think he's a better run defender, but you need guys like him. Got the length that they look for. Can play a couple different spots. Even again, might be someone they could kick out to 5 tech if they need it. I like Taquan Graham, and I think he'll end up making it as well. Moving on to linebacker as we get towards the end of this projection. 4 guys here. I think they'll keep this unit leaner, given that Jalen Walker is probably going to factor in here a little bit from time to time, or at least some snaps. He could kind of be their emergency extra linebacker. Again, this was a very disappointing group last year relative to expectation. The only one that really lived up to their billing was Caden Ellis. Troy Anderson once again missed most of the season due to injury after playing his best game, getting hurt on special teams in the fourth quarter. Kind of just sums up his career and how the Falcons have kind of used him. So I don't know what we could expect from Anderson. He's still going to factor in. But the Falcons did go out and sign Divine Diablo from the Raiders to give them a coverage linebacker, someone who's very athletic if Troy Anderson's not available. He's kind of a wild card to me. I don't know how big of an impact he'll make, but he could be a good fit, in this scheme, which does like to use those faster, lighter linebackers. JD Bertrand is still going to be here. I think he'll make this roster as the 4th guy, but didn't really make much of an impact as a rookie. Has some potential, certainly, but we'll see. But I think Bertrand has to kind of watch out for these other linebackers that the Falcons have brought in. I think, Nick Kubitz is kind of interesting as like a special teams ace, which, again, a lot of times this 4th linebacker is mostly going to play special teams. And also Malik Vernon, who is a former safety who the Falcons are converting to linebacker. Another guy that could push for that spot. So Bertrand's got to earn that spot, but I do think he's got the advantage at this point. Cornerback, this is an interesting group with some new faces in it potentially. Obviously, they've got AJ Terrell and Mike Hughes manning the outside spots. I think those guys are going to be good. I think that's pretty much set. The nickel spot is going to be a wide open competition, right? D'Alfred's back. He's going to compete for that. This scheme I think might fit him better. We'll see if it's going to be completely zone like last year or if they're going to play more man. The more man they play, the better off Alfred's going to be. They also drafted Billy Bowman Jr., who's going to be, probably Alfred's main competition in the slot. At this point, I would probably expect Bowman to win the job, given that they drafted him pretty high and have that expectation. But I think either way, both Bowman and Alfred probably make the roster, and whoever loses the competition is going to be the number 2 and sort of depth guy. We know Alfred's a good special teamer too. And then I think UDFA Cobee Bryant, one of the big questions of the episode, can Nick Nash and Cobee Bryant make the roster? I have Nick Nash making it, and I have Cobee Bryant making it too. The simple fact of the matter is the Falcons didn't really bring in much else at corner. They brought in a lot of sort of like fringe roster guys. His biggest competition is probably like Mike Ford Jr., who's more of a special teams star. But I think that, given that the Falcons have good special teamers elsewhere, they don't necessarily need Mike Ford as much as they have in years past, potentially. And I don't think they're going to risk losing Cobee Bryant to waivers for Mike Ford, if Bryant looks good. I do think Natrone Brooks is someone to watch here too, especially in the slot battle. He could kind of be a sleeper there. I think he's looked good when he's got a chance to play, so I would keep an eye on him too. But this could be one of the more interesting groups for sure in terms of these camp battles to watch the slot job and sort of the depth roles here. Going to be one of the more interesting ones for sure. Moving on to safety, this one's pretty cut and dry, I think. And I think it's actually really good from top to bottom. Jesse Bates III, we know he's one of the best in the game. The Falcons drafted Xavier Watts, who I think is one of the best safeties in the draft. I think he's going to start right away and bring some impact ball hawking skills to this defense immediately. I think these two together, Bates and Watts, could be one of the best ball hawking duos in the NFL. So really excited to see that. And then behind them, the Falcons have two sort of thumping, more box-oriented safeties in Jordan Fuller and DeMarco Helms. I think both of these guys are going to make the roster. I think they're both good options. Again, neither one of them are high-end coverage guys, but they're also like reliable enough, that they're not going to make huge mistakes, so they're just not going to be able to have the range that Watts and Bates can do, and they're not that type of ball hawk, but they're both good. They're both high floor like guys, and I think they'll be more than good enough with their run defense and their ability to do sort of whatever the team needs. That special teams pretty straightforward. I'm not really projecting any changes there. I think it'll be Younghoe Koo, still holding on to that job. That the Falcons did bring in Lenny Krieg to compete there, but I think it'll be Koo that ends up returning to form, right? So good for him. Hoping that works out. And then Bradley Pinion and Liam McCullough at punter and long snapper. And then at returner, like I said, I think Jamal Agnew, if he could stay healthy, probably wins that job. I think he's still a good return specialist. Just the health has been his problem. And then River McLeod probably factors in there too on kick returns. But I do want to mention Nate Carter, the undrafted free agent running back, because of his testing. He could be someone to watch there. Same thing with like veteran Philip Dorsett, who was always known for his speed. So these are some other guys that could be sort of factoring in there. But yeah, what do you guys think? That's the 53. I also added a practice squad into the written article, which is just complete conjecture at this point. If you want to see that, you could go check it out on the website, thefalcoholic.com. That's just pure guessing, but you could go see who makes it. That'll become a little bit more meaningful as we see more and more practice in preseason and stuff like that. But I think this is a very different roster defensively than last year, particularly up front. I think we'll see a much more cohesive scheme on the defensive line. The coverage should be more aggressive. I'd love to see that. I think the Falcons added a lot defensively, and I feel good about it. I like the way this is shaping up. Hopefully, we'll see these guys perform in camp, and we'll have an injury-free summer here. And we'll go into the preseason training camp feeling pretty good about how this looks. So thank you guys so much for watching Dirty Birds and Brews podcast today. Kevin Knight at Falcoholic. Kevin, please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. Both those metrics help us out a lot. If you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon. It's patreon.com/falcoholic-live. You can also join the YouTube channel memberships if you're more of a video enjoyer. But yeah, we're going to have lots of great content coming for you guys. We're going to have a rookie minicamp update with Joe Patrick on Wednesday, and have hopefully another show with Trayshawn coming to you guys next week as well. So yeah, stay tuned. We got a lot to cover here as we get into sort of the mini camp season. And we will continue bringing you guys all the updates and schedule release coming out next week as well. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, guys, thanks again for watching Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. Thanks for our sponsor, BetOnline, for sponsoring today's episode. We will see you guys next time. Have a great day, folks.